Shadow of the Colossus. This game is a masterpiece. This is somewhat well known, but it deserves the praise it gets, nevertheless. The sheer magnitude of this game was impressive back in 2005 and still is to this day. Witnessing these walking behemoths and actually being able to climb them and then kill them never ceases to feel like an epic undertaking. Sure, it may seem a bit boring, having to ride the horse between each boss fight, especially since there are no other enemies besides the 16 colossi that you are trying to take down. But Shadow of the Colossus has such an atmosphere to it. The world is so barren and empty that it really makes you feel like you are trespassing and should not be here, which fits the game thematically, and also serves to give you some reprieve between fights as well. The story is a classic deal with the devil tale, where the main character makes a bargain with a demonic being in an attempt to save the girl he loves. It's rather meta, as it's about him being unable to let go, and then the gameplay itself is about holding on to each Colossus and fearing letting go. It's one of the best Faustian stories, and tells it through gameplay, which is even more impressive. There are also some puzzle elements as well, as each Colossus has a unique trick to it that you must figure out. But even if you know all the tactics, it's still an epic game to play through. Top 10 material for sure. He who fights monsters should take care that he himself does not become a monster. Vanquish. Most third-person shooters are rather dull. Think of something like Uncharted, and how you just take cover and wait for an opening, take a shot, and then repeat the process until you've cleared the entire room of enemies. Vanquish subverts this typically boring gameplay loop with a gimmick of being able to slide around with rocket boots. The gameplay also goes into slow motion whenever you shoot while sliding. This adds a satisfying depth to the combat that is missing in most third-person shooters. Vanquish even features barriers that you can take cover behind, which then become turrets that shoot you, reinforcing the idea that you are not meant to play this like Uncharted or Red Dead Redemption. You are meant to move constantly. I must confess though, that the story is a bit garbage. It is sort of mocking 80s action movies. The main characters consist of a cool badass who can't go 5 minutes without smoking a cigarette, and a gruff macho military general who is often at odds with the main character. Funny enough, you can actually use the cigarettes in-game to fool enemies, which is actually pretty cool. The villains of Vanquish are the Russians, which is really cliche, but it feels more like a satire than anything, as if the game is actively trying to be a so bad it's good action flick from the 80s. You know, something that they'd make fun of on Best of the Worst or something. But the story is not why I play the game. The gameplay is. It's super fun, even if the game is a tad short. I especially love this enemy called the Unknown, which can surround itself with robot parts and guns, becoming a mechanical Lovecraftian creature that can traverse the walls and ceiling, and can also tear you in half if you get too close. I wish that this game had more time to develop, or that they made a sequel, because I'd love to see this concept fleshed out a bit more. Like perhaps fighting an unknown while other enemies attack you, or fighting two unknowns at once. Scenarios like that, which unfortunately are not in the game. There are so many cool boss designs and level concepts that are done well, but this game has so much more potential. It's a shame that they'll likely never make another. But even as it is, this is awesome and fun to play through. I also love the dystopic solar punk aesthetic. There's a very high skill ceiling to the combat here, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. Great game. Dead Rising 2. Now it might be difficult to argue that this game is high art in any way, but I love this game with all my heart. It is the definitive zombie video game to me. It works on so many levels. It can be mindless fun, as you can just go around the mall killing zombies in ridiculous ways, and the game has an absurdly immature sense of humor. It even has Playboy advertisements in-game, so it might be a bit insulting to include this alongside something like Shadow of the Colossus, but nevertheless, I will make my case for it. Dead Rising 2 also serves as excellent satire, which is the other level that this game works on. I really hate to use this word, as it is too politicized, and largely has no meaning because of this, but I do believe that Dead Rising 2 is a perfect parody of capitalism. Interpret that how you will. Dead Rising 2 just showcases the clown world that we live in, fan and has such fun with this concept. Dead Rising 2 can just be a fun time to fool around, or it can possess some deeper themes if you really dig into it. And sadly, it has aged a little too well.
It was on TV, just like Slappy.
Don't believe everything you see on TV, kid.
Infamous. This is a superhero game, and the best one. Much like Vanquish, this is a third-person shooter, with more depth to it. Except this time around, the depth comes not from sliding around, but from the verticality of the environments. Being able to climb buildings and whatnot makes the combat far more engaging than something like Uncharted. And Infamous has the bonus of having a far more interesting story than Vanquish. This is not a feel-good superhero story by any means. Infamous tackles the burdensome nature of what it would be like to actually be a superhero in real life. The media lies about you, the government uses you for their own nefarious ends, and your best friend gets jealous of you. And the post-credits scene ends Infamous on the most doomer note possible. This is quite possibly one of the least glamorous portrayals of a superhero I've seen. That said, it's not too gloomy. It's still a fun time. Zeke adds much needed comic relief to the story, and traversing the environment and fighting enemies is a ton of fun. The good versus evil mechanic is admittedly a bit wanting and gimmicky, so I highly recommend playing as a good guy, at least on the first playthrough, as the story and gameplay functions far more effectively for a good guy playthrough. But all in all, this game is solid. Also, Kessler might be one of my favorite villains of all time. Infamous's ending hits me on a deep personal level. If you know, you know.
What separates the strong from the weak is the ability to take the beating. Hell, to love the beating. No matter how great the pain, never wavering from what needs to be done. Think you can remember that?
LittleBigPlanet 2. I could have just as easily picked LittleBigPlanet 1, as they are both great, but I'll give it to 2, just by a hair, since there's far more stuff, and quality of life improvements. LittleBigPlanet 3, however, not quite as good. Anyways, the first two LittleBigPlanet games are largely lumped together in my mind. They bring out a strong, early 2000s nostalgia for me, truly a product of another era. Brings to mind all the reverence for the Frutiger Arrow aesthetic that's been everywhere at the moment, a form of Zoomer nostalgia. This theme is ever present throughout the game. While the look of this game is a bit schlocky, and dare I say, a bit kitsch, and the optimism of this Frutiger Arrow theme has certainly not panned out, I will say I still find it rather wholesome, even if this vision of the people of the world holding hands together in unity and peace seems downright laughable today. LittleBigPlanet is a platforming side-scroller game. It's not quite 3D in a conventional sense, but it's not 2D like a Mario game either. It's almost 2.5D. The gameplay is rather simple, mostly involving jumping and grabbing things. But the game makes the most out of this concept, and there are other power-ups and vehicles to make it more interesting. There are puzzle elements as well, especially if you attempt to collect all of the items in each level, which is quite satisfying. Multiplayer also adds another dimension to the game. Rather good time with friends. Of course, the highlight and selling point of LittleBigPlanet is the level editor, creating your own stages to play through. For me, this meant making really hard and annoying levels to troll my friends back in the day. Even now, I come back to these games and still create levels. It's fun playing God and jumping around, even if the game's tacky platitudes have aged a bit poorly. Alice Madness Returns. Alice in Wonderland is a perfect template for a dark and twisted tale. And if you were like me, and were rather disappointed with the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland, and want a proper, grim and goth take on the story, Madness Returns is for you. I love 3D platformers, and this is a fantastic one. Most 3D platformers have a childhood innocence to them. Mario 64, Spyro the Dragon, and my favorite, Crash Bandicoot. Usually, the genre is wholesome and child-friendly, and the only time you ever see an adult 3D platformer is when it's a comedy game that is deliberately subverting the formula, like Conker's Bad Fur Day, or any game that's based on an adult cartoon, like Family Guy. Alice Madness Returns is a genuine, serious 3D platformer that is aimed at an older audience, which is quite rare. Right off the bat, this game is disturbing, and stays consistent with its uncomfortable theme. It even goes into horror game territory, especially in the last two chapters. The platforming itself is also unique, as you get not only a double jump, but a triple jump, and each jump allows you a glide, so you can traverse massive distances without needing to land. especially compared to other platformers. There is also a shrink mechanic, which allows you to see invisible platforms, and go inside smaller tunnels that you can't go in while normal sized. These are mostly utilized for finding collectibles, but add significant depth to gameplay. There's also combat sequences, so you aren't just jumping around the whole time, and these fights are actually incredibly engaging. You get 2 melee weapons and 2 projectile weapons, and all 4 can be upgraded as well. There is an absurd amount of enemy variety, and the enemies change in each chapter, keeping the action fresh. Honestly, outside of the Souls games and those unique third-person shooters I mentioned, this is the most satisfying combat system I've seen implemented in a game. Alice Madness Returns has a charming personality to it. Each chapter has a vivid and distinct theme, from steampunk to underwater to Asia, and Alice herself is amusing as well. She's so nonchalant in the face of absolute insanity, and her inquisitive nature and strange vocabulary is a delight to experience. But I shall warn you, it gets very dark towards the end. Not for the faint of heart. I really hope that the proposed sequel, Alice Asylum, does actually get made, because I'd love to see the gameplay fleshed out even more, and I'm curious what insane visual imagery is in store.
Ah, it's you again, Alice. You may approach.
Why would I do that? You want to eat me?
Brutal Legend. It would feel wrong to leave this off the list, given that I'm most well known for my metal videos. Brutal Legend is a metal music themed video game. I will note that strictly from a gameplay standpoint, this might be the weakest game on the list. As in, if this game weren't about metal music, I would have likely picked another game. And if you are someone that does not care for metal music at all, you will likely not get a lot from this experience. That said, I love it and it's worth playing. Brutal Legend has an open world full of creatures and side quests, which was pretty ambitious back in 2009, and the game has a good amount of cool lore and mythology about the land and its inhabitants. You get a car to drive around in, fitted with a radio blasting metal tunes of course, and honestly, I have enough fun just driving around listening to the music and admiring the scenery. There's a huge amount of collectibles in the open world to find as well, so you can literally spend hours just driving around looking for stuff. Ironically, I enjoy this part of the game far more than the main missions. Brutal Legend is a real-time strategy game. I don't know if I can really explain an entire genre of video game in this video, but basically, you and your opponent are spending resources on creating units in an attempt to overtake each other. You build towers to generate fans, which are a currency you can use to buy soldiers, which include headbanger metalheads, and bikers that can heal them. Essentially, you just want to pump out as many troops as you can, and from what I can see, it's better to play offensively rather than defensively. Though I will say I don't entirely understand it. Real-time strategy games do not appeal to me. Strategy games, generally speaking, give you time to think and, strategize. But since it's in real time, you just end up sending wave after wave of troops to their inevitable death. Perhaps real-time strategy games are just not for me, and are a more niche game genre. But then that begs the question, why did they choose this as the main gameplay type in the story mode? A type of gameplay that's alien to most gamers, is not intuitive at all, and is a bit jarring, juxtaposed with the open world aspect. Driving around, finding collectibles, and these real-time strategy segments might as well be 2 entirely different games. My beef with that aside, let's talk about the game thematically, and the most important thing, the music. Brutal Legend has a great soundtrack, of course, but it's very much geared towards Gen X. For the most part, it consists of 80s and 90s metal. I suppose that we can write off the 70s, since there was not a lot of metal music back then, and there's definitely enough Black Sabbath in the soundtrack anyways. But as for 2000s metal, there's actually not a lot of it, considering that the game came out in 2009. Just a few melodic black metal tunes, Dragon Force and Tenacious D pretty much. You are certainly not going to hear any nu metal or metalcore in this game, despite it being the peak era for both of those styles. The game even opens up with this intentionally awful band called Cabbage Boy, which is clearly mocking both Korn and Limp Bizkit. And then our main character, Eddie Riggs, laments that he wasn't born earlier, as he was born in the late 70s and would have rather been born in the early 70s, cementing that this game is Gen X coded once again.
You ever feel like you were born in the wrong time? Like you should have been born earlier? When the music was real?
Like the 70s?
Earlier. Like The early 70s.
This is fine, of course. The soundtrack is amazing, as I will reiterate, but if you are a younger metalhead who picks up this game and expects to hear Avenged Sevenfold, but are instead surprised to be greeted with Bread Fan by Budgie of all things, that's why. Most of the soundtrack consists of things like Slayer, Motorhead, and Judas Priest, but there is some industrial metal and melodic death metal for a bit more variety. Brutal Legend has a lot of personality to it, even featuring Ozzy Osbourne, Lemmy, Rob Halford, and of course, Jack Black as Eddie Riggs. It has a lot of love put into it. Despite all my gripes, it's still a top-tier video game, a must-play for any metalhead. Crash Team Racing. I'm including both the original CTR as well as Nitro Fueled. The original game is a classic. To some, it may be regarded as a Mario Kart clone, but CTR is much better, and I will die on that hill. Sure, if you just want to socialize with friends and family in a casual setting, then maybe Mario Kart is better for that, since Mario Kart punishes the person in first place, and so basically makes it random chance who wins the race, so both your grandpa and your toddler cousin can beat you in a race easily. But Crash Team Racing actually requires some skill, and is more fun in a competitive sense. Not to mention, you can actually save your power-ups for an optimal moment, whereas in Mario Kart, you lose your power-ups whenever you get hit by something, which, let's be real, is every 5 seconds. So that system incentivizes you to just immediately use your power-up the instant that you get it, because otherwise, you will just lose it in 5 seconds. The only thing that makes you lose power-ups in CTR are the pink potions, which require 10 Wumpa Fruit to get, so they are rare, and since they are just placed on the track, it's your own fault if you run into one. Whereas in Mario Kart, most power-ups just instantly hit you, without any reasonable way to dodge them. I'm just getting this out of my system. I hate Mario Kart. I hate Mario Kart. CTR has an immensely satisfying drift and boost system, and you can chain these slides together to maintain speed. In the original game, you can also hop repeatedly as well, since for some reason you don't lose momentum in the air, so as long as your wheels are not touching the ground, you will not slow down. All this just makes CTR an addictive experience. There's an adventure mode too, where you can do timed relic challenges and race bosses, and there's also battle arenas which are fun to play with friends. CTR is the best racing game ever made. The remake is also fantastic. They added an incredible amount of detail to all the tracks. They look phenomenal, and they also went above and beyond by also remaking all of the tracks from Crash Nitro Kart as well, which is good because Nitro Kart was a pretty mid game, so it's nice to see all the tracks from it get put to use in a better game. In addition to all that, they also added 8 brand new tracks. People complain about the monetization aspect of Nitro Fueled, but this is a lot of good free content, so I think it's a bit silly to complain about the monetization, as it is merely for cosmetic items that change very little. You can also do challenges for the coins instead, which can be fun. Sure, the game could be a little bit more generous with the coins, but all in all, I'm happy with it. My only complaint about the remake is how unnecessarily PC it is. I don't know if it's just from fan backlash or studio interference or what. It unfortunately seems inevitable in games these days. And I hate to sound like the cliche gamer crying woke at everything, but it's definitely true, especially here. In the original CTR, the alien villain, Nitrous Oxide, declares that if you lose, he'll make you all his slaves.
If your driver wins, I'll leave your miserable little rock alone. But if I win, I'll turn your entire globe into a concrete parking lot and make you my slaves.
In the remake, he says minions instead.
But if I win, I will turn your entire globe into a concrete parking lot and make you my minions.
Lame.
I already hate this, because I can't hear the word minions without thinking of those annoying little yellow guys. Not to mention it completely deflates the threat and makes Oxide far less menacing. Granted, I probably would rather be a slave than a minion, but that's besides the point. But also, apparently the reason for this change was some kind of racial connotation with the word slave. I can safely say that when I played the original CTR as a kid and heard Oxide use the word slave, I wasn't envisioning Crash Bandicoot picking cotton in a field somewhere. Your mind has to be completely warped by ideology to even make that connection. They also changed the word watermelon to summertime, and literally the word black, like just the color black itself, to carbon fiber in some of the character costumes. It's actually insane the measures that they went to. I'm almost surprised that they didn't erase the N off of Cortex's forehead. They also removed the trophy girls that were in the original game. I suspect that this has something to do with that Grid Girls controversy from a few years back. And I don't want to seem like a total degenerate that's disappointed that there weren't Bandicoot boobies in the remake. But the trophy girls added a lot of character to the original game, and are pretty iconic, so it's quite lame that they removed them. Thankfully, these things for the most part are easy to ignore, and I still enjoy the game a lot. This politically correct stuff is pretty much unavoidable in video games today, as sad as it is to say, and it's why most of my picks on this list were released between 2009 and 2011, rather than later on, because the games industry has been terrible the last decade. But there is a lot of love put into this game nevertheless. I can't let all that effort be dismissed just because some moral busybodies inserted their agenda into the game. I do adore this remake overall, but I do intend on continuing to replay the original game as well, so that I always have a version without these silly Orwellian revisions in it, and also so that I can take all these fun illegal shortcuts that they patched out of the remake. Mad Max. In the sea of mediocrity that is 2010's video games, this is absolutely a standout. Mad Max is the only game on here made after 2011 that isn't a remake, and even this game is getting pretty old now, being from 2015. It is loosely tied in with the 2015 movie Mad Max Fury Road, but it very much has its own story, which honestly has more in common with the original 1979 Mad Max, though aesthetics-wise, it is clearly far closer to the 2015 one. However, even if you have never seen a Mad Max film, this is still worth checking out. When I first played this, I knew very little about Mad Max, and the game was so enjoyable, it made me interested in checking out the films, but it stands well on its own regardless. Reviewing my list for this video, I have realized that most of my favorite games are rather depressing, and this one might be the most depressing out of all of them. There is nothing but wasteland as far as the eye can see. There are essentially only two environments in the entire game, junkyards and deserts. Despite this limitation, Mad Max is oddly gorgeous and memorable. There are lots of distinct landmarks and various territories that have their own distinct biome, even if ultimately they are just variations on junkyards and deserts. Mad Max has a bleak atmosphere. The screen is almost always saturated with color, whether that's the excessive brightness of the sand dunes, the drab dark and gray caves, or the green glow of geysers. This game had every right to be bland and forgettable, yet it's quite vivid and striking. Much like Brutal Legend, I can have fun by merely driving around doing nothing in particular. But there are plenty of enemy drivers ready to kill you for scrap, so if you want the luxury of driving around in peace, you'll have to reduce the enemy threat in each territory by completing missions. Mad Max has both vehicular battles as well as hand-to-hand combat. The car fights are rather fun, with satisfying explosions, even if the fights are often lopsided. Mad Max loves to wreck your day often. The melee combat is more forgiving and pretty fun, even if it is a bit button mashy. It has that Arkham fighting style that's in other games like Shadow of Mordor. You also get a gun, but resources are scarce, so you gotta make your shots count. My only real issue with Mad Max is it is a bit repetitive at times. The bleak theme is the highlight of the game. Finding artifacts of the idyllic past that show what once was, and contrasting it with the harsh reality of the present, is just such a punch to the gut, in a good way.
Those who survived, those are the truly broken, for they know what was before. Those who survived, those are the truly broken.
Before I get to number 1, here are some honorable mentions. Excitebot's Trick Racing. This is another fantastic racing game you should play instead of Mario Kart. A Nintendo Wii game, Excitebots is a bit more physical than the other games on the list. You play as these robot animals driving around realistic environments, doing cartoony minigames to collect stars. Excitebots is utterly insane. There's far more to it than your average racing game. There's nothing philosophical about this one, just fun for the sake of fun. Bulletstorm. I'm generally not the biggest fan of first-person shooters, but this one is a lot of fun. The gimmick of Bulletstorm is that there are unique and creative ways to kill your enemies. Most first-person shooter games are a bit mindless, but Bulletstorm allows you many options to defeat foes, which adds another layer to the combat. Much like Excitebots, this game is just fun for fun's sake. Bulletstorm is crude and raunchy, with a very early 2000s type humor. The villain is hilarious as well. He's so over the top, rude, and evil, you just love to hate him. Crash Bandicoot 4, it's about time. I've always loved the Crash games, and Crash 4 is a love letter to the series. It truly feels like a continuation of the classics. It also seems like it is specifically targeted towards those who grew up with Crash, but are adults now. Crash 4 is full of references to other Crash games, and is surprisingly difficult. It recaptures how hard the original Crash games felt as a kid, by providing a genuine challenge that is difficult even as an adult. I can't even imagine trying to beat this game as a kid. I'm sure that this game would still be fun for kids if they were doing a casual playthrough, but 100%ing this game would be an absolute nightmare. The levels are much longer than the old Crash games, and the placement of some of the crates is downright sadistic. I might have smashed a controller if I had access to this when I was younger, because I absolutely would have attempted to complete the game, being the perfectionist that I can be. I am absolutely the target audience for Crash 4, and I very much appreciate it. This is my favorite game of the 2020s so far. Elden Ring being a close second. Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, the video game. I wanted some variety on this list, so I'll include a fighting game. Not my favorite type of game. Never really been into Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or those types of games, but this is pretty fun. The dueling mode is the highlight. Best played with friends. There's a variety of moves and characters to choose from. The single player campaign is pretty decent too. Not quite top 10 worthy, but for a movie tie-in game from 2005, this is quite great. SpongeBob SquarePants, Battle for Bikini Bottom. I've always been a fan of SpongeBob, and Battle for Bikini Bottom is a great tribute to the early seasons of the show. Great 3D platformer as well. Up there with some of the best. A classic from my childhood that still holds up. Demon's Souls, the original Souls game. While the later games refined some of the elements that are a bit awkward here, I still think Demon's Souls is special, even among the other Souls games. It really changed the way we think about video games. The mechanics were unconventional to say the least, and some of them were never replicated, even in the later Souls games. World Tendency, for example, changes the difficulty and number of enemies, and can grant access to secret areas and items. So if you die in human form, Demon's Souls actually gets more difficult and blocks you off from certain areas. Rather bold game design, being this punishing to the player. Also, the final boss might be my favorite boss fight of all time. It's hard to explain why exactly, but it seems like a perfectly even match. And since the run up to him is unpleasant, and he has an attack that can literally de-level your character, it's one of the few Souls fights that is fair, yet still gets my heart pumping every time I fight him. And with these honorable mentions out of the way, you can likely guess my number one pick. Dark Souls. What can I say? This is my favorite video game of all time. I am of course referring to the first game. 2 and 3 don't quite compare. I know that Demon's Souls is the true first game, and I love it as well, but I do think that Dark Souls is better overall. Between the two games, Dark Souls wins out, even if just due to how open the world is. The other games are much more linear, but Dark Souls 1 allows you to travel to many areas right off the bat. Unlike the other Souls games which just have you fast traveling constantly, in Dark Souls 1 you don't get the ability to fast travel until you are already 2/3 of the way through the game, and by that point you will have a decent understanding of the layout of the world. It's impressive how interconnected everything is, and on subsequent playthroughs you'll be surprised how many different paths you can take in different orders. Despite this, most players give up right at the beginning in Firelink Shrine. Many are overwhelmed and perplexed about which way to go, and the punishing nature of the game can be discouraging as well. Not to mention, the story is vague, and your role in it is unclear. Dark Souls basically does the opposite of most games. There's no marker pointing you in the right direction, no yellow paint indicating the correct path. The guy that you meet in Firelink Shrine, the crestfallen warrior, does not tell you that you are the chosen one, and that only you can save the day. In fact, he tells you that you're screwed, and that you are not the first hero to try. You aren't special, and that you should just give up like he did. And most people do just that. They quit right then and there. In some sense, Dark Souls is an anti-video game, as in it does everything it can to make you ask yourself, why am I playing this? What differentiates the quitters from those who get good is the ability to answer that question. Dark Souls has an existential quality. It provides you with an overwhelmingly large world, difficult enemies, and does not inform you on any context as to what you are even trying to achieve. You yourself must come up with answers. Maybe you just like a hard challenge. Maybe you want to explore and see what's next. Maybe you think you'll find answers if you persevere. Whatever reason, you gotta have intrinsic motivation to play Dark Souls. If your answer to "why am I playing this" is "I have no idea," or "I'm doing this because my friend is making me play it," then you will likely not get much further than Firelink Shrine. The combat system of Dark Souls is what makes or breaks the game for most people. The stamina system is genius. Every time you attack with a weapon or block with a shield, you lose stamina. If you have no stamina, you can't really do anything, not even run away. You also regain stamina faster standing still than while moving, and regain stamina slower while your shield is raised. This system punishes those who just button mash, and also those who cower behind their shield or run from every fight. Dark Souls also features input buffering, so if you press a button, you are committed to that action. This also severely punishes those who button mash. The multitude of enemies and hazardous environments also truly test a player's skill and patience. Oh, and you also can't pause the game. This is actually awesome. One of the reasons I find Skyrim and games like it so lame is because you can simply pause the game mid-fight, drink a bunch of potions, and jump back into the action with full health. Since you can't pause Dark Souls, you often have to wait a moment for an opening to heal yourself, and it takes a couple seconds, so it leaves you vulnerable to enemy attack when you are healing. All these mechanics and lack of mechanics may seem hostile to the player, but if Dark Souls had a pause menu where you could replenish your health and stamina back to full instantaneously, it would completely ruin any tension that any battle could bring, and rob you of the challenge as well as the satisfaction of victory. The verticality of Dark Souls is also genius. You ascend to fantastic heights and descend to horrible depths. And combined with the open world, it's an epic undertaking that even Shadow of the Colossus can't match. And the game loads while you are in elevators, organically integrating an in-world reason why you have to wait a moment, rather than staring at a load screen. In fact, with the exception of when your character dies, you can pretty much go the entire game without seeing a loading screen. The bosses are legendary too. I know that some prefer the Dark Souls 3 type fights, but personally, I think they got a bit carried away in the following games. Ornstein and Smough is a great fight, one of the best of the entire series, but part of what makes it epic is the build-up to it. When the later games have 6 fights in a row that are of similar difficulty to Ornstein and Smough, it just gets fatiguing. Some bosses like Pinwheel or the Iron Golem are pushovers, quite literally in the latter case. But could you imagine if both of these bosses were replaced by Manus? That would not be an improvement. Harder is not always better. Both Sen's Fortress and the Catacombs are difficult enough on their own. Getting an easy win on these bosses is just a way to end these areas on a triumphant note. I want to dispel the myth that Dark Souls is synonymous with really hard game, because it is so much more than that, and it's unfortunate that even the series itself has bought into its own meme. I love Elden Ring and everything, but why does every single boss have to be more epic than the last one? Why do we need 2-phase boss fights? With one shiny anime fight after another, you just become numb to it. By contrast, the original Dark Souls is pretty restrained. I enjoy fights like Sif the Wolf that are actually pretty easy, but are far more replayable than many Elden Ring bosses. Dark Souls actually makes the Sif fight easier towards the end, as she starts limping, and it starts to make you feel bad about what you are doing. Sif can't even really hurt you in this state, and seeing her persevere in spite of her injury hardly makes you feel like a hero. Far from being a noble slayer of demons, you are just putting down a puppy who is only there to prevent you from grave robbing, which is hardly noble in itself. You have to come up with some explanation for what you are doing. You have to rationalize or romanticize your struggle somehow. Every character that you meet is lying, either to you or to themselves. So it's up to you to decide for yourself what the truth is. Dark Souls is all about having a reason to keep going. In the absence of inherent meaning, what meaning can you create for yourself? This is why Dark Souls is an existential masterpiece. I also enjoy creating my own challenges to make the game fresh and more difficult, like doing a no Estus flask run or things like that. Dark Souls may be hard, but ultimately, the only true obstacle to victory is your desire to give up. Don't you dare go hollow. So there's my list. Hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know your top 10 games below. Praise the sun.
Hello there. I will stay behind to gaze at the sun. The sun is a wondrous body, like a magnificent father. If only I could be so grossly incandescent.